I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that I've been participating in and some of the things the Academy of Pediatrics says about sports and specialization. But I think I have to come up here and kind of, as I'm listening, I'm reflecting about my roles. I have a 12-year-old son, a 13, nearly 14-year-old daughter. They both play a couple of sports. They both play year-round. I coach. I've coached soccer, I've coached basketball, I've coached baseball. I still coach soccer, so I'm one of those soccer coaches. So I'm trying to make sure I'm not as guilty as all the coaches were criticizing. I may be. I come up from it as a parent who also has kids who want to play. So I'm a coach, I'm a parent, I'm also a physician, and I play multiple roles. And sometimes your brain tells you to do one thing and your emotions tell you to do another. And I'm probably one of those type A personalities who enjoys doing what I do, maybe works a little too hard at times, and doesn't let go, and doesn't allow myself to let go. And so I think that the people in the room probably share a little bit of the same experience that I do, that you're interested in these topics, you want to do the right thing, and sometimes it's not always easy or not always clear. And I think I struggle with my own kids of how many sports should they be doing? Should they be doing 3 days a week, 4 days a week? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that I've been part of, and then a little bit about what we don't know. So a couple of years ago, we were interested in looking at sports injuries, youth injuries, and so we had a multi-center study, and we tried to figure out, were we seeing acute injuries or chronic injuries? And when we looked at our data, we were looking at ages really 6 to 18. We found that about half the injuries were what we considered acute injuries, falls, things that kids do, and then half of them were overuse injuries. So those are the ones who were making it to my office. When we looked at the overuse injuries, we saw that most of them were in the older age groups, and then we try to tease that out a little bit. And the interesting thing is we did our study, our study collection period was timed, it wasn't really optimal for the East Coast, it was for the West Coast where the study was originated. And they were looking for the winter months. And I kind of argued that we should have been looking in September and October, November, because how many kids would have played on a travel team and also played on their school team? And at the time, EPYSA hadn't adjusted their schedule, and so that their high school travel was still overlapping with their college. We've since divided that out a little bit, and now we've tried to cut down on the number of exposures. And so we looked at that data, and we found that half of these overuse injuries were occurring. And when we looked at why it was occurring, probably the biggest factor was scheduling. And so we looked at who got scheduled. And we looked at how many practices a week was this? How many teams were they playing on at the same time? And the reality is I have the same dilemma right now as a U12 to be U13 soccer coach, that my team and my son is in 6th grade. And next year they're going to go to 7th grade. And a lot of the 7th grade schools have after-school sports, which I encourage all of the kids to do. But they all practice soccer, and all my guys are going to join soccer team after school. And it's mandatory for a number of the private schools. The public schools don't have that and I live in Philadelphia, and so we don't have that for some of our public schools, but the private schools do. So some of my players are going to be practicing 5 days a week with their school team. And then I'm the travel coach, and I'm supposed to practice twice a week like all the other travel coaches in the area. And then on Saturdays and Sundays, there's going to be, one of those days is going to be a game. And so how do we balance practice schedules, games? I think that's a challenge, and I don't know that I have all the right answers. I can tell you what happens, though, is the ones who practice too much get injured more often. And so the ones who are playing on 2 teams are more likely to get injured in one. And if the coach at each team isn't recognizing what the other coaches are doing, we tend to run into this, well, my first coach had us run for an hour, then my next coach had us run for an hour, and each coach thought it would be great if they ran for an hour to get some conditioning in, and instead we ran them for 2 hours. And last year I had this for the first time, that I had guys playing on middle school teams, and they were in 6th grade, but some were good enough to make the 7th and 8th grade team. And so now they were having games on the days we were supposed to have practice. And so I told them if they have a game, they're just not supposed to come to practice, which as a coach is a little bit difficult because you want all your guys to come to practice, and now we're like making exceptions. But I felt that was probably the socially responsible thing to do. This year we'll have it even more. I'm not sure how many times we're going to practice. And I have the dilemma that some of the kids practice 5 days a week and some don't practice at all. So I kind of have to have practices for some of the kids, but not all of them. And so I think there is this dynamic and struggle that is real life that we all kind of face. If we look at ages, and my guys are all now 12 going on 13, so they're starting to get into this age of a little more specialization. If we look at ages 6 to 12, when we should be doing that sampling, we have found out that early specialization doesn't lead to better performance long term. And in Europe, they've actually looked at this very topic, and they found that specializing between 6 and 12 does not increase your risk of becoming a professional athlete. And when they look at the professional athletes, almost none of them specialize between 6 and 12. And so that would potentially is detrimental to their development. I think that we're starting to recognize this in other sports. And there's been some fallacies that have been propagated. So how many people have heard of the 10,000-hour rule? So a great study about the 10,000-hour rule. There was a guy in Sweden who wanted to be a high jumper. And so he, at very early in life, dedicated himself to being a high jumper. And he practiced and practiced and practiced. And he probably practiced 20,000 hours. And he really thickened his Achilles tendon. And he ended up becoming a world champion. You say, well, there's proof 10,000-hour rule works. The flip story is there was a guy growing up in the Middle East, in the Midwest, who happened to be a good basketball player, but not a great basketball player. And one day he was in the gym and he was competing with some of the track athletes. And as you would expect, there was a little bit of trash talking going on. And so, I can dunk, you can dunk. Well, we're jumpers, we're better than you. So he says, no, I can jump as high as you guys. So the guy says, okay, well, fine, will you prove it to me? So they go to the gym and they put up the bar and they say, okay, here's 6'6", pretty high, this is high level stuff. So he goes over the bar at 6'6". I said, okay, how about 6'8"? Goes over the bar at 6'8". So the guy who's been talking smack to his personal best is 6'10", and he's the top guy. He has a school record. So they put it up to 6'10", and he holds his breath. The guy goes over 6'10". He's like, all right, well, how about 7 feet? The guy goes over 7 feet. He goes to his coach, says, coach, I have a guy who can jump 7 feet. Coach says, what are you talking about? He's like, no, he's already at our school. The coach says, really? He says, yeah, he's a high school guy. So coach wants to see him do it. Form is terrible, goes over 7 feet. He goes on with a few years of training to actually break the world record, beat this other guy. So the 10,000-hour rule probably balances out because one guy spent 20,000 hours and one guy spent almost 0, and they both became national champions. So, be careful about the 10,000-hour rule. The reality is that there was a study that was done in UCLA, and they looked at the players on all the Division I teams at UCLA. And what do you think they found as being the greatest predictor of being a Division I athlete at UCLA? Multisport was one of them, and there was one more important one. Genes. So they looked at how many of those kids had a parent who was either a college or professional athlete, and that was by far the number one factor. So just because you train 12 hours a day, or 12 hours a week rather, as a 6, 7, 8-year-old, the likelihood of becoming a Division I scholarship athlete at UCLA didn't really change. I mean, it was really still about genetics was part of it. And so I think that when we look at 6 to 12, that early age of specialization, you can specialize as much as you want, but just because you specialize at a young age doesn't actually influence your ability to achieve the highest level. Your gene pool does. So I'm not going to be a professional basketball player because I don't jump very high and I'm not very tall. It's just a bad genetic combination. And no matter how many hours of basketball I played, I could become competent, but I wasn't going to become great. And so that's basically what the research is showing, is that your gene pool makes a difference. And interestingly enough, most of those kids at UCLA didn't specialize until about 14 or 15, as opposed to earlier age. There are a few exceptions, and I think we should point them out to be academically honest. That in the sports where your peak is early, and say gymnastics as being one of them, where their peak is 14 or 15, then if you don't start being a gymnast training hard at age 8, you won't peak by 14. The flip side is, in the sports where your peak is in your 20s, potentially specializing too early is detrimental. And so if your peak as a soccer player is going to be in your early 20s, then probably maintaining a love and enthusiasm for soccer, getting some technical development along the way, and then shifting your training into high gear at 15, 16, and 17 actually ends up being more likely to make the national team than less likely. And so I think we have this. And Dr. Sakati mentioned earlier about the baseball players. And I found one study that I've always remembered that was done in the early 90s. They looked at all the professional pitchers who were in the major leagues at the time, and they asked them how many had been an all-star pitcher at age 12. And what was the answer? 0. Probably because all the really good kids blew their arm out before they got to succeed. And so some of those guys actually had gone on to make the pros as a position player, but none of them were pitchers. And so I think that the allure is, well, if I get training early and I get this extra development, that's going to help me on the back end. And what I'm saying is, from a developmental standpoint, developing all your muscles probably is more important than developing a certain set of muscles. And so it probably is detrimental to your long-term goal of being an elite athlete by specializing too early. So there is a time for specialization. I'm not against specialization, but I think we have to pick that time. The American Academy of Pediatrics does have some recommendations. They do recommend at least 1 month off. Those recommendations are being redone right now. The last one was, I think, in 2007, and they're redone every 7 years. So there should be a policy statement coming out. I've talked to the people who are doing that policy statement, and one of the problems is we just don't have a lot of data about early specialization. When should it start, when should it not? I think the other important factor that's been brought up is that when you look at early specialization, you have to look at the emotional development of the player. And so when is someone really ready to be pushed hard? And so you may be able to push someone hard at 17 or 18 or 19 because they're emotionally ready to handle that. If you try to push a kid at 8 or 9 or 10 really hard, emotionally they're not ready to deal with that. They don't understand what you're trying to do always. They do perceive it as being too much. And as a result, they kind of lose their passion. And I think if you looked at professional sports, what you probably find is people who are passionate about that, at least through their developmental formative years. And if we push kids too hard too early and they lose their passion, then they don't train as hard when it really makes sense. And at the soccer level, probably the higher level training makes a difference at 15, 16, 17, 18. And so if you push them too hard at 8, 9, and 10, you may lose them at 15, 16, 17. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. As a parent, I want to see my child succeed. I want to see them do well. And I sometimes have to try to make sure I step back and put on the brakes. As a coach, I also want to see all my players do well. I want to make sure the experience was a fun one for them. And if I don't take into account these other things with development. And so I think as the pediatrician, sports medicine person, I have to kind of think, what is developmentally appropriate for this age? What is the long-term goal here? My son has my genes. He's probably not going to be a pro athlete. I can guarantee he's not going to be a pro athlete. Maybe he might be a doctor, but I just have him go to school like everybody else. I don't push him academically yet. There'll be a time to be pushed. As I tell people, I went to school for 24 years. So grade 12 is halfway through. If I burn someone out between grades 9 and grade 12 by pushing them, and they lose the passion, you need the passion later on to be able to get through the other 12 years of schooling. So I think you don't want to burn out in anything, whether it's academics or athletics or music for that matter. So you try to keep all those in mind as an educator, as a parent, as a coach. And so I think that's really my message, that think about what's the long-term goals and how do we get there. And sometimes doing too much too early may be detrimental to those long-term goals.